Welcome to PopVibe Studio. Glad you dropped in, glad you stayed. If you like this vibe, please tap like, follow the channel, and hang out with us. Now lean back, let the lights dim a little, and listen. You don't notice the little towns until something pulls you there. A faded postcard, a job listing for an archivist, a cousin's half-remembered story of a place where the fog sits in the trees like a quiet congregation. For Jamie Cruz, it was an email, short and official sounding, that promised records preservation and temporary lodging, and most importantly, a paycheck that would let him buy a new mixer and breathe. Jamie was born in a city that never slept, a city where subways breathed and sirens sang, where concrete rooftops smelled faintly of pizza and possibility. He had a way with sound, a habit of turning the hum of refrigerators and the clack of rain into music, into memory. He had a small studio, a battered field recorder, and a drawer full of tapes labeled in someone else's tidy hand. Parish Archives, the email had said. St. Augustine's Church, East Hollow. He read the name and felt the name press like a coin in his palm. Round, heavy, worth more than its face. East Hollow was the kind of place where Main Street kept its original cornices, where every other building offered antique something, and where the diner still listed meatloaf as a nightly special. The church rose at the center, white steeple pointing like an old compass needle, brick warm in late September sun. People waved as Jamie crossed the intersection because people in small towns were polite, and because he looked like the sort of person you could ask for directions. The job was simple, on paper: catalog audio reels, digitize recordings of services, transcribe old homilies and choir practices. The church had been running since before Jamie's grandparents, and the parish archive smelled like lemon oil and dust, the kind of smell that told you someone had once loved these things into order. There was a back room, a little room with a single high window, and on its table a stack of unlabeled reels, brittle and Murphy faded. They called them legacy tapes, like something that belonged in an attic chest. But when Jamie threaded the first reel across the player, the hiss unfurled like a throat clearing. At first it sounded like a Sunday, in the way that Sundays have a sound. A rustle of hymn books, someone coughing politely, a child practicing scales in the corner. A voice, low and measured, read the readings. A choir rose thin as a memory, then swelled into the room like a body returning to itself. Jamie smiled into his headphones. The job suddenly the best kind of lonely work. One where you could disappear into other people's lives, and then, mid-psalm, the sound bent. The bell chimed, but not from the tape, not from the church tower. It came from deep within the recording, a hollow, slow toll that vibrated through the reels into the table. It chimed an odd measure, not the steady strike you hear on a wedding day, but a stuttering, as if someone had tried to remember the rhythm and kept forgetting. After the bell, a voice shifted. A child's voice, small and bright, singing a lullaby Jamie didn't know, with words that felt like they were stitched from the edges of prayers and something else. Jamie paused, rewound, leaned close, and the lullaby played again. The words were simple, soft like bread. And then, in the space between lines, a whisper that wasn't on the label. It wasn't like the coughs or the pew creak. It threaded through the hymn like a seamstress's stray thread. He smiled the way people smile when they find a mistake that can be fixed. He noted the time code and kept listening. The more reels he listened to, the more other things slipped into the Sunday sounds. Footsteps that stopped at the chancel rail, the rustle of a heavy robe, where no one recorded a procession. A hum that wasn't organ, but underlay organ like a second landscape. Once in a recording labeled Christmas Service 1987, a child's voice counted quietly to itself, then recited, with the small solemnity of the unknowing, the names of people who did not exist in the parish register. Evelyn Thomas, the boy with the locket. The list stopped. The choir swelled again and the tape carried on, obliging as if nothing at all had happened. Jamie asked the parish secretary about it. She was a warm woman named Ruth, who kept a calendar full of funeral dates and potlucks, who had a way of looking you over like a neighbor checking a fence. She blinked and folded her hands. Some of those tapes, she said, voice careful. They've been here a long time. Father O'Leary wouldn't talk about them. The old sacristan, he used to say, "Not everything deserves to be played twice." Not everything deserves to be played twice. The line lodged in Jamie like a stone in a shoe. He wanted to know why. He wanted to know how a child's counting could survive on tape, how a bell could misremember its own toll. He wanted, embarrassing to admit, to be the one who could string those loose threads back into sense, the one who could patch the tear in the parish's fabric. There was a pay bump in being curious, pride, and the kind of arrogance only people who fix things possess. In the weeks that followed, Jamie walked the town and listened. He recorded the wind in the cemetery, the creak of the rectory gate, the laughter in the diner that sounded like waves under a dock. He learned the rhythms of East Hollow, the school bell that let out at 3, the church clock that struck on the quarter hour, the solitary dog that barked at midnight. He noticed things other people accepted. The way the steeple cast a long, thin shadow in the early afternoon, like a finger pointing to the river, like a name written on the surface of the world. He found hints in the margins. An old newspaper clipping in the archive, yellowed to the color of old bread, told of a small scandal from decades earlier. It was under the fold, so Jamie read it out loud, the words catching in the empty room. There was mention of a choir practice, a missing child, a velvet-toned box, and a phrase that made Jamie's throat tighten. Unexplained sounds were heard at the altar. The clipping had no byline, and the margin scribbles, "Do not speak of this during services," looked like someone's prayer. There was a rumor, the kind that looks solid because everyone knows it, that the church had once been built around something else. The foundation sat on swampy land, people said, where water remembered the old names of things. Some claimed that before the church, there had been a chapel, then a farmhouse, then a burial ground older than the town's charter. In East Hollow, memory stacked like linoleum, newer surfaces laid over older ones. And now and then, something old would knock. Jamie started to hear the lullaby in other places, on the radio when he turned the dial for static, in the hum of the street lamps as night came. He told himself not to be spooked. He told himself he was a professional, a human magnifying glass for noise. He told himself much in the way people tell themselves the moon is only a rock. One afternoon, a week that smelled like rain and library glue, he met Elena Morales. She ran the Historical Society, a tidy building on Maple, with a bell the town used as a suggestion box for donations. Elena had dove into the town's past with the kind of energy reserved for people who love what others neglect. She wore a jacket with elbow patches and had a notebook with 100 tabs. "You've been listening to those reels," she said when they met by accident at the archives. She didn't ask, she knew. "They find their way into people," she added, like a diagnosis. "You ever hear the lullaby at the bake sale?" Jamie told her his tape hunt story. She nodded, and then, quieter, she said, "There used to be a convent long ago. Not official, not like the big seminaries. A small sisterhood in the hills. Folks around here called them the Garden Sisters, whereas they looked after lost children and babies, and they had a bell, an old handbell. Elena tapped the table, and the sound was like a small thing trying to remember its full ring. They disappeared one winter. There was a fever, or the river rose. People weren't sure. The church bought the land, built over them, quieted it. That night, Jamie pulled an old ledger with a cracked leather spine from the society shelf. It listed names in a neat, looping hand. Sister Agnes, Sister Bernice, Sister Lila. Beside them, dates that ended abruptly, and then a blank space where a page had been torn out. The ledger smelled of lavender and rust. He traced the letters like Braille, and the silence of the building leaned closer. The more Jamie found, the more the town's everyday sounds rearranged themselves into a slow, interpersonal hush. The bell in the tower, which had been repainted last year and chimed on the hour, sounded different when he listened closely. It seemed to answer its own questions, ringing not the way a modern bell did, but the way an old one remembered being rung by hand, by someone who cupped it and tried to coax a child's voice from metal. On a misty Saturday, when the cemetery looked like a field of waiting heads, Jamie took his recorder to the foot of the churchyard. Because that's what you do when you want proof. You take a device that mistrusts ghosts and you let it listen. The recorder caught the shift of wind, the rasp of dry leaves, a crow arguing with the day, then, faint as breath, a lullaby. Jamie sat very still, like a man who'd been asked to hold his breath forever. He followed the sound down the old stone path that led behind the church, to a part of the grounds that people seldom walked. The grass was bone-tired, the stones leaning like old people at a bus stop. There, half swallowed by a curtain of ivy, Jamie found a stone, not quite a tombstone, more like a marker. Moss had done its gentle work. Carved into the face, just letters, nothing else, were names in a hand that looked like it had been cut with a small knife. He brushed away the moss with his gloved hand, and the letters showed. 2 names, a date. Underneath, in a different hand, scratched as if by someone who'd forgotten the proper tools, a 3rd name, the boy with the locket. Jamie's chest tightened. The phrase was the same as the one on the reels. When he took the tape back to his little room and listened again, the lullaby unfurled differently. This time the child's counting returned, but in the middle something else. A voice, older now, gravel and candle wax, asking a question. It wasn't an angry voice, it was small, like someone waking up, groggy and full of regret. "Who remembers our names?" the voice asked, and the question lodged in Jamie's ear like a burr. "Who remembers the bell?" Assembling memory is a delicate craft. Jamie built his days like a restoration project. Listen, label, preserve. But sometimes to preserve, you have to decide what to let rest. The parish records had reasons for the missing pages. The town had reasons for changing the subject at dinner, for switching the radio station when the lullaby hummed in between commercials. People make bargains. They tuck things into boxes behind the boiler room, and they clean the dust in a pattern designed to forget. Jamie, though, was not easily satisfied. He found an old photograph, brittle with age, tucked behind a hymnal. It showed the choir, and in the back, 3 sisters in nuns' habits, faces smudged by time, but their hands linked like a promise. Beside them, a small boy pressed his cheek to the hem of one sister's robe. In his palm, a tiny metal locket glinted, catching light like an expectant mouth. He brought the photograph to Father O'Leary, who was older than the parish registers and who wore his years like a vestment, quiet, practical, full of pockets. The priest looked at the photo without surprise. He handed it back, as if passing a delicate thing you might break by looking too long. We bury the past sometimes, so the living can breathe, he said, voice low as a confessional. That is how towns keep from choking on their own stories. Jamie thought of that for a long time. He thought of breath and suffocation. He thought of a lullaby that kept coming through the real players, that sounded like a name summoned by mistake. And so he did something he is not always proud to admit he did. He played the reels, not to archive, but to listen with intention. He rewound and rewound until oddities lined up like constellations. The bells stuttered at the same precise beat, the child's counting arrived at the same shuddered moment, and in the space between the third and fourth count, a second voice whispered, "Not yet." Once on a night when the town slept like a mouth, Jamie left his recorder on the altar. The church was empty and vast. The candles long burned down, but the building kept a hush like an instrument. He set his field recorder on the altar stone, as if it were a witness, pressed record, and left. When he came back, the tape had not only recorded the Mass, but the subtle noises between notes. He heard someone whispering a lullaby into the bell, as if trying to teach it to sing. He heard the faint clink of a locket. He heard, and then felt, the church breathe, as if someone had entered and exhaled. That night he dreamed he was a bell hung in a tower, but the rope had gone missing. People below pulled at nothing, and his mouth rang into empty air. He dreamed of the sisters walking the aisles in wet shoes, carrying small candles in a winter that wouldn't let them leave. When he woke, he decided to ring the bell. You should not ring another person's bell without asking. In East Hollow, the bell was the church's voice, the town's punctuation. But Jamie had listened to too many recordings, and he felt as if the bell and he shared a secret. He climbed the narrow stairs, the tower smelling of old wood and the faint mineral tang of lightning history. The rope was thick and smooth, knotted where hands had gripped it for decades. He tugged, gently at first, then harder, until the bell replied. One slow, sonorous toll that vibrated down the steeple and into the roofs of the houses. The sound was wrong. It had a tremor like a cough, like someone trying to name themselves after forgetting their own syllables. It rolled over the town and woke people at the edges. An old woman who kept the bakery, a teen asleep in an upstairs room, a man who walked his dog and hummed under his breath. Dogs lifted their heads, and somewhere a kettle whistled. And then the lullaby answered. Not on a tape, not in Jamie's headphones, but in the air itself, layered over the bell like a memory finding its way out. Voices rose from the churchyard, not many at first, but then gathered, soft as moth wings. The voice of the choir, the whisper of children counting, the thin, sure voice of a sister humming a tune she once taught a child. It was not an angry sound, it was a request. It was someone asking the town to remember. People came to the church, drawn by the sound, by the bell's uncertain call. They came in slippers, wrapped in coats, carrying flashlight beams and the night's residue of coffee breath. They stood in the nave in their pajamas and coats and smiled with that odd, sleepy solemnity you have when you are sure you're late for something you have never been invited to. Father O'Leary stood at the door, and his face was an uncomfortable map. He could have closed the doors, called the police, or dismissed it as a prank. Instead, he opened the church wide, and the sound folded in. Jamie watched them. He felt like someone holding a match near a moth. He heard conversations begin, the small talk that buttered over the edges of community. Someone mentioned the convent. An older man remembered a child who used to leave toys by the locket tree. A woman said she'd once dreamt of a bell she could not ring. And then, at the front of the nave, the air shimmered like heat on asphalt, though the night was cool. A figure shifted into form. Not solid, not quite. more like a pattern of light rearranging itself into habit and hands. It was a woman older than the photographs, her face folded like a map, but with a child's patience. She carried a handbell cupped in one hand, the metal dull with the sheen of decades. Her lips moved. She hummed the lullaby. The crowd did not panic. They were, as Jamie had never been, ready to listen. A child stepped forward without fear, and the woman knelt and held out the bell. The child reached, small fingers grazing the metal. The sound that came out when he rang it was not wrong, not misremembered. It was true. It was a note that said a name. People sobbed, then laughed, then reached for one another. It was as if a silence had been unstitched, and the cloth underneath smelled of bread and dye and the little hands that tied shoes. The bell tolled, and each ring landed on a different chest, like a key turning a lock. Father O'Leary later called it a moment of grace, which is to say he put it into a frame that his parishioners could put on their mantle and use to explain the day. He set up a day for remembrance, a simple thing. Candles, names read aloud, a potluck in the parish hall, where everyone brought something that reminded them of someone else. People left notes in the church, names of loved ones forgotten. And the ledger at the Historical Society was filled with pages that had once been missing. Jamie watched as the town did what towns do: talk, remember, argue, and then decide. Not everything was neatly tied. Some nights the lullaby still found its way into the tapes, shy, as if it were still practicing. Once, months later, Jamie drove through East Hollow at dawn and heard, beneath the traffic hum and the coffee stand's hiss, a child's counting drifting from the cemetery steady as footsteps. He smiled because sometimes remembering is an unstable thing, not a one-time triumph. You have to remember again and again, like learning a song's chorus. Years from that night, people would tell the story differently, of course. Some would call it a communal hallucination, a contagious memory that spread because the town was tired. Some would credit prayer. Others would say the archivist with the field recorder finally put something back where it belonged. Jamie, when asked, would say it was a matter of listening with intention, of giving a name back to a bell that had been trying to speak. At the core, the town had to reckon with the fact that memory is not only what you keep, but what you choose to keep alive. They had kept certain pages turned, yes, but they had not burned them, not really. They had tucked them away. And when the bell misremembered, the papers found their way back into air. Jamie left East Hollow on an early spring morning carrying a hard drive full of digitized reels and a photo tucked into his wallet. He had more recordings now than he knew what to do with, and the field recorder's battery case had a dent from too many hills. He still worked with noise, with the way sound could be turned into story and into comfort. He sometimes played back the reels on quiet nights, not to hunt, but to sit, like a neighbor hearing a song through a thin wall. When the lullaby swelled, he hummed along, and sometimes he would find himself counting too. In the end, what haunted St. Augustine's was not some malevolent presence. It was memory, stubborn and tender, refusing to be buried neatly under plaster and brick. A bell forgot its name, and the town taught it again. People gathered, and in that gathering they remembered the sisters and the boy and the lullaby, and the air that had been hollow filled. So when you let a town take care of its own ghosts, what happens is not a spectacle. It is a slow, awkward, beautiful repair. Things get said, names get called, pots get passed, casseroles get eaten, and the bell rings in a way that is finally right, at least for that night's sky. And if you ever find an old reel, somewhere tucked in a box, and you play it and hear a lullaby, Don't be afraid. Lean in, press pause a little more gently than you would on a machine, and listen for the spaces. There are voices in the margins sometimes that want only to be named. Thanks for listening to this story from PopVibe Studio. If you felt that chill, that little tingle in your spine, show some love, hit like and follow, and share the vibe. We make stories that live in the sound, and we'd love to keep you along for the next one.